So it's time to test our handlers, and testing handlers can always be a little tricky, but it's not that bad, and we'll go through the entire process. So I'm looking at my handlers right now, and when you look at these, you'll realize pretty quickly that we need a fair bit of information before we can ever test a given handler. For example, I'm looking at the home handler. I'm going to need a response writer, I'm going to need a request, I'm going to have access to the session because I'm putting something in here. And I'm really not going to be using that later. I'll take that out of the home handler at some point, but I'm definitely using it in other places. So for example, when I do a post request, I store the reservation in the session. So there's a fair bit of things that I need to actually have set up. And what I'm going to do, of course, is create two files. One of them is where I'm going to set things up. So in the handlers folder, I'll create setup_test.go. I'll create that. That's where we're going to set up our testing environment. And then I need a place for the actual tests themselves, which of course needs to be called handlers_test.go. And again, just to remind you, if it doesn't end in _test.go, it's not considered a test. So I've created both of those files. Now let's start with the setup. And let's think about what we need to have in here. Well, it's pretty much the same sort of thing that we have in our main function. So in main.go, I have this run function, and I definitely want most of this stuff. So I'm going to copy all of this. Actually, I'll copy all of it right down to here, and I'll go to setup test, and I'll create a function. Now I could use the test main function that we talked about last time, and we'll do that in the next step when we get to testing our render functions. But for right now, I'll just demonstrate that you can use any function you want to. So I'll create a function. I'll call it, what shall I call it? I'll call it func get roots, because I know I'm going to have roots at some point. Otherwise, I can't call the handlers at all. And since it's going to be giving us roots, it'll hand back exactly what our roots application does. So if I look at roots.go, it returns an HTTP handler. So I'm going to need that. So I know I'm going to be returning an HTTP.handler at some point. And I better spell func right. All right. And then I'll just paste in what I got from my main function. Now we have some errors here right away. I don't have an app variable. I don't have a session variable. So we can create those. That's no problem. Let's create our app variable, which will be var app config.appconfig. That will hold our application configuration. And let's create a sessional variable too. And we'll call that session. And that's a pointer to scs.sessionmanager because we're using our Alex Edwards SCS package. And that's what the session variable is for that given package. So great, that fixed up most of the errors, but we still have one here. Log fatal cannot create template cache. Well, we're going to have to change that template cache in a minute, but we just won't return an error. And down here we have handlers new repo. Well, we're in the handlers package, so I don't need to actually specify that. The same thing here for new handlers. Okay, and then we have render new templates in app. And then we actually need our roots. So let's open up our roots file. And we'll copy all of this right down to here. Copy that, go back to our setup test, and we'll paste it in. And again, we have some errors. Now the errors are once again because we're actually in the handlers package, so I don't have to specify the handlers package. So what I can just do is edit, find, search, and replace, and I will look for handlers.repo and just change it to repo. Replace all. And that fixes those errors. Now we also need our middleware. Now our middleware is stored in the main package. That means we can't import, because you can't import your main package. But what we can do is open the middleware file and just copy those. And close this and come back here and we'll just paste them. I'll put them down here. It doesn't matter where they are, but I'll paste them in here and suddenly all of our errors go away. So this probably set up our environment. Let's just check everything and make sure we've got it right. So we come in here and we say get roots. We register the reservation that we're going to store in the session. We have to have that because one of our handlers does precisely that. We set in production to false. That's fine. We set up our session exactly as we do in our main function. Then we store our session in the application. That's good. Next we have render create template cache. So let's look at the create template cache function that's in the render package. So this looks like it should work, but it won't. And the reason why it won't work is not immediately obvious. It's right here. When I load the templates, like the page templates, for example, I'm hard coding the path to the templates folder. And that's fine when we start our application from the root level of our directory, as we've been doing all along. But when we run our tests, our handlers underscore test, when we write those tests and run it, we're not actually running the application from the root level of our folder. We're running it from, instead, the handlers folder, which is inside the internal folder, which is inside the root level of our application. So we need to change that. And it's really easy to do. What I'm going to do is go to the top of this file and create a new variable, which I will call path2templates. And I will initialize that with the default value of /templates. Then I'll go back down to my create template cache, and I'll just make this a format sprintf, and get rid of the /templates, put in a string placeholder, and then put in our path to templates. Now, when this application runs, I can actually set that variable. Now, this isn't going to be terribly useful right now, but it will be useful when we get to the render part, so we may as well do it right now. I can actually substitute whatever I need at the first part of this path to the templates using this variable. So we'll do the same thing here. This will be a placeholder, %s, and then format sprintf, and put in our variable path to templates, and the same thing here. This will be a %s, and we'll put in format sprintf, path to templates, and close our parentheses. All right, so that will solve that problem. So that's something that's going to be helpful in the next section when we start testing our render handler. So we may as well do it right now because that hard coding is going to be a bit of an issue. But in our setup tests, I actually don't want to call this create template cache directly. What I'm going to do instead is copy that function, the entire thing, just so I have complete control over my testing environment. And there are many ways to do this, but this one works, and it's pretty straightforward. And I'll put another function in here. I'll paste it in, but instead of calling it create template cache, I'm going to call it create test template cache. And as usual, the IDE can't find its template, so we have to import that, and we need to create a path to templates variable. So we'll do that up here. First of all, let's tell Goland that we're using HTML template, and that'll solve that import problem. Good. So those are gone now. Yeah, all I have to do is create that path to templates. So var path to templates is going to be equal to dot, and then up one level, which gets us to the internal folder, then up another level, which gets us to the root level of our application, which is where we want to be, and then the templates folder. All right, so we have one more error here, functions. Aha. So let's go back to our render package right here and find out what functions is. And this is a variable that holds all of the functions that we want to put into our, or make available to our Goland templates. So let's go back to setup test and just create that variable. And we can leave it empty, and it should solve our problems. Good. So there, it looks like we've got things set up. Let's make sure. When I call the getRoot functions, it registers the models.reservation into the session, so we know that we can use that in the session. We set our in-production defaults, which is fine. We create our session, which is great. Then we store our session in the variable. Then we create our template cache right here, and we say app template cache equals TC, and then we have app use cache equal to false. And that could be a bit of a problem. Let's think about that for a minute. Why might that be a problem? If we have use cache set to false, it's going to rebuild the page on every request. But when it actually rebuilds the page in render, let's see this. If app use cache is to true, then get it from the template cache. Otherwise, create template cache. And that's a problem. That's a problem because when it calls this function, it's going to be using this as the path to the templates. So let's go back to our setup test and make app use cache equal to true. And that should work for us. Okay, so we've got this set up. Now let's write just one test, just to get things out of the way and see if we can make this work. And what I'm going to do is think about how I'm going to do this. Well, first of all, I have a whole bunch of pages I want to test, or a whole bunch of handlers I want to test. I could write each test individually, but it seems to me it makes a lot more sense to run table tests. And when I call a given handler, I need to know certain things. First of all, what's the path to it, which matches the things in our routes file. And our routes file in this case are in the setup_test.go. So I need to know that. For some of the routes, I'm going to be posting information. For example, when I post to make-reservation, I'm filling out a form, and it has first name, last name, phone, email, and eventually it'll have more information. So I'm going to need some method of holding post data. All right, so let's think about what we're going to do here. What I'm going to do first of all is create a type, and this type is going to be something that holds whatever we're posting to a page. So I'll call it post data, and it's just going to be a struct. And inside of that, I'm going to have two things, just like we have in our forms. For example, on the input for first name, we have an input with the name of first name and the value of whatever the person typed into that form. So I'll call the first part key, which I will spell with an E and not an A, which is a string. And then whatever they type into it will be a value, which is also a string. Okay, so I've created that. Now I'm going to create a variable for the actual tests. So I'll create a var and I'll call it the tests. It will be a slice of structs because we're going to have more than one, or potentially more than one test we want to run in our table test. And structs is not plural. Inside of that, I have to define the actual struct. So what are we going to have? Well, first of all, I'm going to call name. That'll just be the name for the test. That'll be whatever I want to call an individual test. Then we have to have the URL, the path which is matched by our routes, and that's a string. Then I need to have the method. Is it a get or a post? That's just a string. Then I need to have possibly params. Those would be the things that are being posted. And that's going to be, a form can have more than one input, most do, so it has to be a slice of post data, which we just defined right up above here. And then finally, we need something to test, something to say whether or not a test has passed. And the easiest thing to test for, right now at least, is what kind of response code are we getting back from the web server? If it's 200, everything worked the way it's supposed to. If it's 404, page is not found. If it's in the 300 range, it's a redirect. So I'm just going to say expected status code, and that will be an int. Okay, so we've defined our struct, but it doesn't have any values. So I'm going to put an equal sign here, just to make this shorthand. I'm going to define my struct and populate it with data all in one step. So, because this is a slice of structs, inside of these parentheses that I just created, I'm going to have each entry in its own curly braces. And the first thing I want for my first one, let's just test the home page. So we'll name our test home, because we're testing the home page. The path to that is just slash, and that's straight out of our routes file. The method is get, because there's no form being posted on the home page. And then I need to specify the params. Well, there are no params for the home page, so I'll just put in a slice of post data and make it empty. And that satisfies that requirement. And for the status that I'm getting back from the server, I could put 200 because that is status OK. But I like to use the constants built into the standard library, http.statusOK. All right, so there is one thing we can test. Now, let's just test that one by itself to make sure we have everything right. So we'll write the actual test here. Func test handlers, which is just a name that I'm choosing because I'm testing all of my handlers. And it has a parameter of t, type of pointer to testing.t. And inside, we need, first of all, to get our routes. Well, remember, we have this function we set up in our setup_test called getRoutes. And that returns, first of all, it sets a whole bunch of things up, and then it returns mux, and mux is our router. So we can just call that function. So go back to handlers test and say, routes is assigned the value of getRoutes. There, now we have our routes. Now here's the cool part. How are we going to create a web server that actually returns a status code, something we can post to? We need to, in effect, create a server, and we also need to create a client that can call that server. And the great thing about testing in Golang is that all of this is done for us. we can just create a test server and store it in a variable. So I'll create a variable called TS for test server, and I will assign that the value of HTTP test.new TLS server. And that requires, well, you see what it requires just by rolling over top of it. It says it requires an HTTP handler, which we just got when we called get roots. So we put our roots in there. There. Now I've created that server. Now, once you create this server, it's going to fire up for the life of this test. It's going to listen on a port. It's going to open some things. And it's always good practice to close that when you're done with it. So we can do that using our defer keyword, defer ts.close, which is a function built right into that package. So as you know, from way back when, defer doesn't get, whatever's after the keyword defer doesn't get executed until after the current function is finished. So when test handlers is finished, it will close the test server. Now, we need to do something to actually run our individual tests. And this is a table test, so we'll use exactly the same logic we did last time around. The last time we did a table test. And it's been a while, but for, I don't care what the index is, so I'll use the placeholder for that, the blank underscore. And then I'll name my individual test as I'm running it, E, because I got to call it something, and E works. That's going to be assigned the value of range through the tests. Now, inside of that for loop, there are really two kinds of tests we're going to be running. There are ones that make GET requests, like just showing the home page or showing the about page. And there are ones that make POST requests, ones that are where a user fills out a form and submits that as a post. So we need to determine which kind we're going to run. And we can do that really easily. If e.method, which we specified right up here, if that's equal to get, do this. Otherwise, it's post. Now, right now, I'm just going to deal with the GET request. We'll do the POST request in the next lecture. So what do we want to test here? Well, we actually need to make a request as a client, as though we were a web browser accessing a web page. Unfortunately, that functionality is built right into TS, our test server. We can call TS client, which, not close, client, which effectively creates a web browser or a web client. And then we'll call the get method on that, and we'll call our URL. Now, you might think that's just e.url, which is, in this case, is slash, but actually, we need a little bit before that. We need the part that actually calls the web server, and we don't know what that is. We don't know what port it's listening on. Fortunately, TS does. Our test server has URL as an available value we can call. And all we do is append our URL to whatever the test server's URL is. So we've now called that. Now, we're not doing anything with this. We need to store that in a response, which I'll call response. And get actually returns, as you can see if you roll over it, two things. It returns the response, which is a pointer to a response, and it also might return an error if something goes wrong. So we have to trap for that. So response and error are equal to our test server client make a GET request to the URL we want to test. Then we check for an error. So if error is not equal to nil, then what are we going to do? Well, let's go with t.log. We'll log the error, and then we'll fail the test, t.fail. T.fatal will kill it for us, and we'll put the error in there too. All right, if we get past that, then we need to check our response. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it by looking at the status code we get back from our test server and comparing that with our expected status code. And all we have to do is say if resp.statuscode is not equal to our expected status code, e.expected status code, then write an error, t.error, and this time I'll use error f, just so I can put a more meaningful error in there. It works just like sprintf, and I'll just say for, and the test's name, which is a string, expected, the integer, what our expected value is, but got the other integer, the one that we actually got back. And then we replace those placeholders with our actual values. So e.name is the name of the test, e.expected status code is the expected status code, and resp.status code is the status code we actually got. And that should be enough to test our home page. So let's try it out. Go to my terminal, and let's run the tests. Make sure we're in the right directory. I'm not. So cd internal handlers. Now I'm in the correct directory. And let's run the test. Go test-v for verbose. And it failed. What did it fail with? Oh, I see what I forgot to do. So let's go back. I forgot to actually use that test create templates in our setup. So let's go to setup.go, setup_test.go, and find the part where we actually, yes, this should not be render create template cache. As I said, we built a new one and put it in here just for this purpose. So let's go back to our terminal, clear the screen, go test-v. And it passed. Perfect. All right, so let's go back and try a few more routes. So in our tests, we need to add some more test data. So let's see what else we have for gets. Under our setup test, let's look at our routes. We have a get for about, for general's quarters, and for major suite. Let's do those. So we'll just duplicate this one three times. So we have one for about, one for general's quarters, one for major suite. And all I have to do here is change the URLs. /about, /general's quarters, and major's suite. Let's see what other ones we have. We have a get for search availability. So let's do that one. Search availability, which I'll just call SA, and change the route to search availability. Any more? We have one for contact and one for make reservation. So contact and make reservation. Contact, which is just contact, and make reservation. Make reservation. All right, so we have those set up. Those all look right to me. Let's find out if they are. And we will go test-v. And they all passed. Good. Now let's make sure it's actually working. Instead of having status OK here, let's change that to status not found. Now this should fail because you won't get a 404 when you go to make-reservation. And it failed. Good. So we'll just change that back to status OK. Perfect. So those are our GET requests. And in the next lecture, we'll actually do our POST requests. And that's not terribly difficult either.